Tangier, 1325. A young man of 21 stands at the city gate in the early morning dark. His mother is beside him. His father has not slept. He is going to Mecca, a journey of roughly 3,000 miles, and he expects to be gone for 16 months. He will not return home for 24 years. By the time he does, he will have walked and sailed and ridden across what we now call 44 countries. He will have survived shipwrecks, plagues, a rebel attack in the forests of India, and the destruction of an entire diplomatic mission in a single night. He will have served as a judge in Delhi, navigated the courts of the Mongol steppe, and stood at the edge of the world he knew. His name was Ibn Battuta. Many people in the English-speaking world still could not tell you his name. Marco Polo travelled roughly 15,000 miles and has been in many history textbooks for generations. Ibn Battuta travelled, by his own account, something closer to 75,000 miles, and the gap between their levels of recognition is one of the more interesting puzzles in the history of human exploration. This story is, in part, an attempt to close that gap, settle in, let the noise of the day fall away. Tonight we follow one of the most travelled human beings in recorded history. From a quiet house in Tangier to the far edge of the world he knew, and back again. This is his story, and it begins not with adventure, but with a family, a faith, and a town that had no idea what it had just produced. Chapter 1. The world he was born into. To understand what Ibn Battuta became, you first have to understand the world he was born into, because it was a world that most people in the modern West have only a partial picture of. And without that picture, the scale of what he did is difficult to fully appreciate. He was born in Tangier in 1304. Tangier sits at the northwestern tip of Africa, where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic, where the coast of Morocco looks across a narrow strip of water toward the southern edge of Spain. It was, and still is, a city that feels like a threshold, not quite Europe, not quite the deep interior of Africa or the Arab world, a place where routes converge, a place where people arrive from somewhere else and depart toward somewhere further. His full name was Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Lawati al-Tanji ibn Battuta. The name carries its own map. It tells you his faith, his family line, his tribal affiliation, and the city where he entered the world. In the culture he was born into, a name was not decoration, it was documentation. His family belonged to a class of legal scholars that the Islamic world had been producing and circulating for centuries. His father was a judge. His grandfather had been a judge. His uncles were judges. The expectation was clear, and Ibn Battuta absorbed it from childhood. He would study the law, master the religious texts, earn the credentials, and take his place in the long line of learned men who kept the machinery of Islamic society functioning across thousands of miles of territory. This was not a modest ambition. In the world of the 14th century, an Islamic legal scholar was one of the most mobile and most socially connected figures in existence. The network of Islamic civilization in 1304 stretched from the Atlantic coast of Morocco across North Africa, through the Middle East, down the East African coast, across Persia and Central Asia, through the Indian subcontinent, and into the islands and coastal cities of Southeast Asia. It was not an empire in the political sense. there was no single ruler, no unified army, no central capital that controlled it all. What held it together was something more durable than any of those things. It was held together by a shared language of scholarship, a shared legal tradition, and the annual pilgrimage to Mecca that pulled millions of people from every corner of this world toward a single point in the Arabian desert once a year. A scholar who had mastered Arabic and Islamic law could arrive in a city he had never seen, on a coastline he had never touched, and find within days a community of people who shared his reference points, respected his credentials, and were prepared to offer him hospitality, employment, and a place in the social fabric. The Islamic world of the 14th century was among the closest things the medieval era had to a functioning global professional network. Ibn Battuta was born with a membership. The Tangier he grew up in had a Mediterranean rhythm. Scholars came through. Merchants came through. Pilgrims came through. The sea was always visible, and the routes beyond it were a constant presence in conversation, in the movement of goods, in the faces of strangers who arrived for a few weeks and then disappeared back toward their distant origins. A boy growing up in that city would have understood from an early age that the world was very large, and that it was, for someone with the right preparation, surprisingly accessible. His education followed the pattern of every serious scholar of his time and place. He memorized the Quran. He studied Arabic grammar and rhetoric. He worked through the foundational texts of Islamic jurisprudence, the accumulated reasoning of centuries of legal scholars who had applied the principles of the faith to every conceivable situation a human being might encounter. He sat in the company of teachers who had themselves sat in the company of teachers who stretched back in an unbroken line toward the origins of the tradition. It was a rigorous education. It was also, by the standards of what he would eventually need, completely insufficient preparation for what was coming, because what was coming was not a career in Tangier. What was coming was the road. The road announced itself in June of 1325, when Ibn Battuta was 21 years old and newly ready, by the standards of his training and his family's expectations, to make the Hajj. The pilgrimage to Mecca was one of the 5 pillars of the faith, an obligation for every Muslim who was physically and financially able to fulfill it. For a young scholar from a family of judges, it was also a rite of passage, a chance to study in the sacred cities, to meet the great teachers who gathered there from across the Islamic world, and to return home with credentials that would serve a lifetime of practice. His mother packed his bags. His father gave him money for the road. His neighbours gathered to wish him well in the manner of people seeing off someone they expect to see again before too long. His account, the Rihla, records this moment with a detail that the centuries have not diminished. He was weeping as he left. He was 21 years old, and he had never been more than a short distance from the city where he was born. And the road ahead was long, and the world beyond Tangier was something he understood only through books and the second-hand descriptions of travellers passing through. He was afraid. He was also, beneath the fear, something else entirely, something that would not fully reveal itself for months, not until he had been on the road long enough to understand that the road was not a means to an end, but the thing itself, not a way to get somewhere, but the only place he actually wanted to be. He did not know that yet. He just knew he was going to Mecca. He walked out of Tangier on a June morning in 1325, alone, heading east along the North African coast. He would not walk back through that gate for 24 years, and when he did, nothing would be the same. Not the city, not his family, and above all, not him. Chapter 2. The Road to Mecca. He did not travel alone for long. The road east from Tangier, along the North African coast, was one of the oldest and most travelled routes in the Islamic world. Pilgrims from Morocco, from the cities of the Atlantic coast, from the mountain communities of the Atlas Range, all moved toward the same destination in the same season, and the road collected them the way a river collects tributaries. Within days of leaving Tangier, Ibn Battuta had fallen in with a group of travellers heading east, and within weeks he had something he had never had before, and would spend the rest of his life seeking out wherever the road took him. He had companions. This matters more than it might seem. Travel in the 14th century was not the solitary romantic experience that later centuries would sometimes imagine it to be. It was dangerous, logistically complicated, and deeply social. You travelled in groups because groups were safer than individuals. You shared information about road conditions, about the reliability of local rulers, about where water could be found and where trouble was known to gather. You carried letters of introduction from scholars and officials in your home city to scholars and officials in the cities ahead, because those letters were the infrastructure of a world that had no hotels, no travel agencies, and no maps in any modern sense. Ibn Battuta had the letters, he had the credentials, he had the education that marked him to anyone who knew how to read the signs, as a person worth receiving and hosting and helping along the way. What he did not have, and what he was about to develop with a speed that would have surprised his family back in Tangier, was the instinct for travel itself, the ability to arrive somewhere new and orient himself quickly, to read the social landscape of an unfamiliar city, to identify the people worth knowing and the situations worth avoiding, to extract from every place he passed through the maximum of experience and knowledge before the road called him forward again. That instinct was not taught in any school. It could not be found in the texts he had memorized. It was something the road produced in the people who were built for it. And Ibn Battuta, it turned out, was built for it in ways that his early life in Tangier had given him no particular reason to suspect. His first major stop was Tlemcen, in what is now western Algeria, a city of scholars and merchants that received him with the hospitality his credentials warranted. He attended lectures. He met teachers whose reputations had reached Tangier and whose actual presence exceeded those reputations. He was, for the first time in his life, embedded in a scholarly community that was not his home community, and the experience of being valued for what he knew rather than for who his father was settled into him like something he had been waiting for without fully knowing it. He liked it. He liked it very much. From Tlemcen he moved east through Béjaïa, through Tunis, through the cities of the North African coast that were, in the 14th century, among the most sophisticated urban centres in the world. Each city had its scholars, its mosques, its markets, its network of connections that extended outward to every corner of the Islamic world. Each city added something to the picture Ibn Battuta was assembling of what the world actually looked like beyond the horizon he had grown up with. In Tunis, he stopped for 2 months. He attended lectures. He made connections. He acquired more letters of introduction. And he joined a larger caravan heading east toward Egypt. The country that everyone who had travelled the Hajj route told him would change his understanding of what a city could be. They were not wrong. Cairo arrived at the end of a long approach through the Nile Delta, and the Rihla describes his first sight of it with a wonder that remains vivid 7 centuries later. Cairo, in the 1320s, was among the largest cities in the Islamic world. Its streets dense with a population and a commercial energy that nothing in Ibn Battuta's experience had prepared him for. He describes the markets and the mosques and the traffic on the Nile, the hundreds of boats, moving goods, and people in every direction, with the specific enthusiasm of a young man from a provincial city who has just understood, for the first time, what the word metropolis actually means. He also records something that historians of epidemic disease have found worth noting. He mentions that Cairo was in the grip of a plague at the time of his visit, not the Black Death, which was still roughly 20 years away, an earlier epidemic that was moving through the city and that the population had absorbed with the grim practicality of people who had seen such things before. Ibn Battuta moved through Cairo anyway. He was 21 years old and heading to Mecca, and nothing was going to stop him. From Cairo he had a choice. The direct route to Mecca went east across the Sinai Peninsula and down the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula. It was the faster route. It was the route most pilgrims took. Ibn Battuta took the longer route. He went south up the Nile toward Upper Egypt first, drawn by reports of a scholar whose reputation had reached him in Cairo, a man worth a detour of several weeks. Then he turned east toward the Red Sea coast and discovered that the route was impassable. Armed conflict between local tribes had closed the road. He turned back. He returned to Cairo. He took the northern route through Palestine and Syria instead. This is the first moment in the account where a pattern becomes visible that will repeat itself across the next 24 years. Ibn Battuta does not travel efficiently. He does not move from point A to point B by the shortest available route. He moves toward whatever is interesting, whatever is worth seeing. Whatever scholar or city has been described to him in terms that make the detour feel not like a detour, but like the actual point, he is not. In ein modern sense, a tourist, he is something older and stranger than that. He is a student of the world, treating the entire surface of the earth as a text to be read, and he is constitutionally incapable of skipping pages. Palestine and Syria in the 1320s were under the rule of the Mamluk Sultanate, a state that had held back the Mongol advance into the Middle East and had been governing Egypt and the Levant with a combination of military effectiveness and cultural sophistication for the better part of a century. The cities Ibn Battuta passed through, Gaza, Hebron, Jerusalem, Damascus, were cities at or near the peak of their medieval prosperity. Damascus held him for weeks. It held him the way cities would hold him throughout his life, not through any single overwhelming feature, but through the accumulated weight of everything it contained. The scholars, the markets, the mosques, the particular quality of light in the late afternoon on stone that had been inhabited for thousands of years. He left Damascus in the company of a caravan heading south toward the Arabian Peninsula. The caravan was large. Hundreds of pilgrims moving together through the desert in the organized fashion that the Hajj required. There were designated stopping points. There were water sources that the route had been built around over centuries. There were guards. There was also, inevitably, difficulty, desert travel in the 14th century. even on a well-established route, was a serious physical experience. The heat was extreme. The distances between water were long. People fell ill. The caravan moved at the pace of its slowest functional members, and the dust it raised was visible for miles. Ibn Battuta absorbed all of it. He was young and healthy and possessed of the traveller's capacity to experience hardship as experience rather than simply as suffering. He was going to Mecca. He was 21 years old and nothing else. In that season of his life, felt as important as that. The first sight of Mecca, after weeks on the road from Damascus, is described in his account with a restraint that is itself revealing. He had been building toward this moment his entire life. Every lesson, every text, every conversation in the mosques of Tangier had pointed here. And when it arrived, when the city appeared at the end of the long approach through the hills of the Hejaz, he does not reach for grand language. He simply says that he arrived, that he performed the required rituals, that he was there. The restraint is the description. Some things are too large for elaboration. Chapter 3. Arabia and the Sacred Cities. Mecca, in 1325, was not a large city by the standards of Cairo or Damascus. What it had was the Kaaba, the ancient stone structure at the centre of the Grand Mosque that Muslims across the world turn toward in prayer 5 times a day. And the gravitational pull of that structure drew more human beings to a single point, year after year, than perhaps any other force in the medieval world. Ibn Battuta arrived during the Hajj season, when that pull was at its strongest. Pilgrims from every direction the Islamic world extended were present in the city at the same time. From Morocco and Andalusia in the west, from Mali and the cities of the West African Sahel, from Egypt and the Levant, from Persia and Central Asia, from India and the islands of the Indian Ocean, from the East African coast. The Hajj was among the greatest regular gatherings of human beings on earth in the 14th century, and it was simultaneously a religious obligation, a massive commercial event, a scholarly conference, and the primary mechanism by which information and ideas and people moved across the entire span of the Islamic world. Ibn Battuta understood this immediately. He performed the rituals with the devotion of a man for whom the faith was not a cultural inheritance, but a living conviction. He circled the Kaaba. He walked between the hills of Safa and Marwa. He stood on the plain of Arafat. He did what every Muslim who makes the Hajj does, the same sequence of acts that Muslims had been performing for centuries and would continue performing for centuries more. And then, when the rituals were complete and most of the pilgrims were already turning back toward their distant homes, Ibn Battuta stayed. This is the moment that changed everything. He stayed because Mecca and Medina, the 2 sacred cities of the Hejaz, were also among the greatest centres of Islamic scholarship in the world. The scholars who gathered there during the Hajj season were among the most distinguished in the faith, and they remained in the cities for months, available to students willing to sit at their feet and absorb what they knew. Ibn Battuta was willing. He was more than willing. He spent months in Mecca. He sat in the company of teachers from across the Islamic world. He added to his credentials, to the chain of transmission that linked him through his teachers and their teachers back to the foundational texts of the tradition. He listened to men who had studied in Cairo and Damascus and Baghdad and Samarkand and Delhi, and through their accounts he built a picture of the world that was richer and more detailed than anything his education in Tangier had given him. He also walked the city. He walked it the way he would walk every city he ever entered, with the systematic attention of someone who understands that physical space is itself a kind of text, and that reading it carefully produces information that no written source can provide. He noticed the architecture, the layout of the markets, the social geography of who lived where and why. He noticed the pilgrims who had come from places he had never heard of, whose languages he could not understand, whose customs were different from his own in ways that fascinated rather than unsettled him. This quality, the genuine curiosity about human difference that arrives without the immediate need to judge it, is one of the things that makes Ibn Battuta worth reading even 7 centuries later. He was a man of strong convictions, formed by his legal training and his faith, but he encountered the enormous variety of human behaviour across the world. He travelled with an openness that was not naivety. It was a disciplined willingness to observe before concluding. He would need that quality. The world he was about to enter was far stranger and more varied than anything the texts of Tangier had described. Medina was a short journey north of Mecca, and Ibn Battuta made the trip with the reverence appropriate to a city that contained the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad. He describes Medina at length: the mosque, the tomb, the palm groves that gave the city a softer character than the stony landscape of Mecca. He describes the scholars he met there, the conversations he had, the additional credentials he acquired. But beneath the scholarly description, something else is happening in his account of this period. Reading the Rihla carefully, you sense a man who is realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he has no real intention of going home. The decision is never stated explicitly. There is no moment where he says, "I have decided not to return to Tangier." It happens instead the way important decisions often happen in real life, not as a single resolved choice, but as a gradual drift in a direction that feels inevitable only in retrospect. Every time the road offered him a choice between returning west and continuing in some other direction, he chose the other direction. His family in Tangier was expecting him back. 16 months. He had told them. He sent letters when he could. Through the networks of travelling scholars and merchants that served as the postal system of the medieval Islamic world. Letters that arrived months after they were written. He would not return soon. What was holding him was not any single thing. It was the accumulation of everything. The quality of the scholars he was meeting, the scale of the world that was revealing itself to him with every new conversation and every new face. The discovery that the network he had been born into extended so much further than he had understood, that there were cities he had never heard of, where scholars who shared his training were living lives he could barely imagine, and that the road between here and there was open. He had one more thing. He had a dream. He describes it in his account with a directness that makes clear he considered it genuinely significant. In Mecca, during his extended stay, he dreamed that a great bird carried him east across vast distances and set him down somewhere far beyond the horizon. He interpreted this, in the manner of his tradition, as a direction, an indication that the road ahead was the road he was supposed to take. He turned east. He was not going home. There was a moment recorded in the Rihla, in the early hours of a morning in Mecca before the city had fully woken, when he rose from his place in the mosque, circled the Kaaba one final time, and walked out into the street. The pilgrims who had packed the city during the Hajj season had mostly gone. The city had returned to something closer to its ordinary self. He stood in the quiet street for a moment. Then he walked toward the road. It was waiting for him, as it always would be. He had barely begun. Chapter 4. Persia, Iraq, and the Ghost of the Caliphate. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to places where something enormous once existed and no longer does. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of a place that was never inhabited, but the silence of a place that was full, that was the centre of something, that drew the attention of the world for centuries, and that was then reduced to rubble and ash, and the memory of people who could not quite believe what they had witnessed. Baghdad in the 1320s carried that silence. Ibn Battuta arrived in the city roughly 2 years into his journey, cutting from the Arabian Peninsula through the ancient landscapes of what is now Iraq. And what he found there was something that no text he had ever read had adequately prepared him for. Not because the city was dangerous, though parts of it were, not because the people were unwelcoming, but because of the scale of what was gone. Baghdad in its prime, the Baghdad of the Abbasid Caliphate at the height of its power in the 8th and 9th centuries, had been, by the accounts of contemporary observers and the evidence that historians have since examined, among the most significant cities in the medieval world. Its libraries, by the estimates that scholars have constructed from the surviving records, contained hundreds of thousands of books at a time when most European monasteries considered a collection of a few hundred manuscripts to be a significant treasure. Its scholars translated the accumulated knowledge of Greece, Persia, and India into Arabic, and then extended that knowledge in directions the original authors had never imagined. Its markets drew merchants from China, from East Africa, from Central Asia, from the Byzantine Empire. The Caliph in Baghdad was not merely a political ruler. He was the spiritual leader of the Islamic world, the axis around which the civilization of Islam organized itself. Then, in 1258, the Mongols arrived. The army of Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, took Baghdad in a matter of days. What followed was, by the accounts of the period and the estimates of historians who have studied them carefully, one of the most catastrophic events in the history of that city. The scale of the destruction and the mortality is still debated among scholars, as it is with most events of that era. But the agreement is general that the damage was enormous and largely deliberate. The libraries were burned. The irrigation systems that had made the agriculture of Mesopotamia productive for thousands of years were broken. The scholars were killed or scattered. The last Abbasid Caliph was executed, and the institution that had given the Islamic world its spiritual and political centre for 5 centuries ceased to exist. That happened 65 years before Ibn Battuta arrived. 65 years is the span of a single human life. There were people in Baghdad when Ibn Battuta walked its streets who had been children during the destruction, who carried in their bodies the memory of what the city had been, and the knowledge of what had been done to it. The physical evidence was still everywhere. Ruins that had not been rebuilt, neighbourhoods that had been abandoned and not reoccupied, the great irrigation canals silted up and broken, turning the agricultural land around the city back toward desert. Ibn Battuta describes what he sees with the careful attention of a man who understands he is witnessing something historically significant. He notes the ruins. He notes the surviving structures, the mosques and markets and public buildings that had endured and were being used again, imperfectly, by a population doing its best to maintain a civilization that the destruction had not entirely erased. He notes the scholars he meets, men doing real work in a city that was a fraction of what it had been. He also records something that historians of the period have found valuable beyond the obvious. He describes the physical geography of the city with a precision that only direct observation could produce. His account is not merely a traveller's impression. It is evidence, the kind that comes only from being present. This is true of his writing throughout his travels, and it is one of the things that makes the Rihla genuinely important rather than merely interesting. He was a legal scholar, trained in the close observation and precise description of reality, and he applied that training to everything he saw. The result is a document that historians, archaeologists, and geographers have been consulting for 7 centuries. From Baghdad, he moved through the landscape of what is now Iraq and Iran with the thoroughness that characterized all his travel. He visited the tomb of Ali ibn Abi Talib in Najaf, one of the holiest sites in Shia Islam, and describes it with a respect that reflects his genuine engagement with the variety of Islamic practice he encountered across his travels. He visited Basra, the great port city at the head of the Persian Gulf. He moved into Persia, through Shiraz and Isfahan and the cities of the Iranian plateau, each of which had its scholars and its markets and its particular character. Persia, in the 1320s, was under the rule of the Ilkhanate, the Mongol dynasty that had administered the region since Hulagu's conquest, but the Ilkhanate had done something that the original conquerors would probably have found incomprehensible. It had converted to Islam. The grandsons of the men who had destroyed Baghdad and killed its caliph were now Muslim rulers, presiding over a Persian Islamic culture that was, in certain respects, rebuilding and extending what had existed before the conquest. History is rarely simple. Ibn Battuta moved through this landscape with his eyes open and his judgment carefully calibrated. He was not writing propaganda for any particular political arrangement. He was observing what was there, and what was there was a civilization in the process of recovering from catastrophe, rebuilding its institutions and its intellectual life with a determination that he found genuinely admirable. He describes scholars in Shiraz producing work of real quality. He describes libraries being reconstituted, book by book. He describes the particular quality of Persian hospitality, the elaborate courtesy that governed every social interaction, the poetry that was present everywhere, in conversation and in public inscription and in the songs that drifted from the windows of private houses. He was, for all his legal training and his North African background, genuinely charmed by Persia. He was also learning something that would prove essential in the decades ahead. He was learning how to operate in a world that was more politically complicated than anything his education had anticipated. The Islamic world he had been taught about in Tangier was a single, coherent civilization organized around shared principles. The Islamic world he was actually traveling through was a collection of competing dynasties and regional powers and local rulers, connected by the shared language of Arabic scholarship and the shared obligation of the Hajj, but not by any political unity. Navigating that world required skills that were not in any text he had studied. It required the ability to read a political situation quickly, to identify who held real power and who held nominal power, to present himself in ways that were appropriate to each specific context. He was developing those skills with a speed that suggests he had a natural aptitude for them. He would need every bit of that aptitude for what was coming, because the road ahead was not going to get simpler. It was going to get stranger and more dangerous and more surprising at every turn, through landscapes that no map he had access to could have prepared him for. He left Persia heading south and east, back toward the coast where the dhows were loading for the Indian Ocean routes. The world was getting larger with every step, and Ibn Battuta, the judge's son from Tangier, who had cried at the city gate, was becoming something that Tangier had no name for. Chapter 5. The Golden Shores, East Africa, and the Swahili coast. There is a version of the medieval world that most people in the modern West carry around without fully examining it. In this version, the world beyond Europe in the 14th century consisted largely of isolated and undeveloped regions, waiting to be contacted by the explorers who would arrive in ships 1 and 2 centuries later. Africa in this version is a vast and largely empty interior. The Indian Ocean is distant and exotic. The cities of the East African coast, if they appear at all, are footnotes. Ibn Battuta's account of the Swahili coast of East Africa is among the most effective challenges to that version of history available in any language, and it was written in the 1340s by a man who was there. He arrived on the East African coast after sailing south from the Arabian Peninsula on one of the great dhow routes of the Indian Ocean, routes that had been moving goods and people between Arabia, the Persian Gulf, the Indian subcontinent, and the East African coast for at least 1,000 years before Ibn Battuta was born. The monsoon winds that blow northeast across the Indian Ocean in the winter months and southwest in the summer made these routes not just possible but reliable. Generations of sailors had learned to read those winds with a precision that allowed them to cross enormous stretches of open ocean without any navigational instrument more sophisticated than their own accumulated knowledge. Ibn Battuta was not a sailor. He was a passenger, and not always a comfortable one. He describes the experience of ocean travel with the honest discomfort of a man who is not constitutionally suited to it, but who has decided that discomfort is not a sufficient reason to stay on shore. His first stop on the East African coast was Mogadishu, in what is now Somalia, and his description of it tells us something important about a city that most people today associate primarily with more recent and more painful history. The Mogadishu that Ibn Battuta entered in the 1330s was a wealthy and cosmopolitan trading city. Its Sultan received him with a ceremony that he describes in detail, the elaborate protocols of a court accustomed to receiving distinguished visitors from across the Islamic world. Then came the food. He describes the meal that was set before him in Mogadishu with the specific and unguarded enthusiasm of a man who had been eating travel food for the better part of a decade and had just encountered something genuinely extraordinary. Rice cooked in butter, dishes of chicken and meat and fish and vegetables prepared in combinations he had not encountered before, side dishes and sauces and fruits, whose names he did not know in Arabic and had to describe by their appearance. He was a legal scholar from North Africa, sitting in a sultan's court on the East African coast, and he was, by the evidence of his own account, genuinely delighted. This small moment matters. It is one of the places in the Rihla where Ibn Battuta stops being an observer and becomes a person, where the systematic scholar disappears briefly, and what you see instead is a man who is very far from home and has just eaten something wonderful and wants whoever reads his account to understand exactly how wonderful it was. The merchants were prosperous. The mosques were active centres of scholarship. He was not visiting a peripheral outpost of civilization. He was visiting a significant node in one of the most productive trading networks in the medieval world. From Mogadishu, he sailed south along the coast, stopping at the island cities that studded the East African shore at intervals. He visited Mombasa, on the coast of what is now Kenya, and describes it as a large island city with abundant food and considerable wealth. Its inhabitants engaged in trade with the mainland and with the ocean routes in ways that had made them prosperous over generations. His most extended stop on the East African coast was Kilwa, on an island off the coast of what is now Tanzania. House, Kilwa in the 1330s was at or near the peak of its medieval prosperity, and Ibn Battuta's description of it as among the most beautiful cities he had visited is not mere traveller's enthusiasm. It is confirmed by the archaeological record. The ruins of Kilwa, excavated in the 20th century, reveal a city of stone buildings, elaborate mosques, and a palace complex that was, in its time, among the largest structures in sub-Saharan Africa. The wealth of Kilwa came from gold, not gold mined on the island itself, but gold that came from the interior of the continent, from the plateau of what is now Zimbabwe, moving north and east through networks of trade that connected the interior of Africa to the coast, and from the coast into the Indian Ocean trading system, going north to Arabia and Persia, and east to India and beyond. Kilwa sat at the junction of these routes. Its rulers took a share of everything that passed through. The result was a city of considerable elegance and genuine cultural sophistication, where the Sultan dressed in silk and the mosques were built of coral stone, and the scholars were in contact with the intellectual life of the wider Islamic world. Ibn Battuta describes the Sultan of Kilwa with an admiration that is specific and considered rather than generically flattering. He notes his generosity, his justice, his piety. He describes a court that was accustomed to receiving visitors from distant places, and that knew how to make a scholar from Morocco feel that his presence was not merely tolerated, but genuinely valued. What his account of the Swahili coast makes clear is that the cities of East Africa in the 14th century were sophisticated urban centres embedded in a global trading network, governed by rulers who understood the mechanics of international commerce, populated by people whose material culture, whose architecture and scholarship and accumulated prosperity was the product of centuries of continuous development. They had their own histories, their own politics, their own intellectual traditions. Ibn Battuta spent weeks on the Swahili coast, moving between the island cities, attending courts, observing customs, and adding everything he saw to the vast mental map he was assembling of the world. Then the monsoon shifted and the dhows turned north, and he went with them, because his route was far from finished, and the Indian Ocean had more to show him than he had yet seen. But the East African coast stayed with him. It appears in his account with a vividness and a specificity that is different from his descriptions of the more familiar parts of the Islamic world. He was recording places that most of his eventual readers would never have heard of, and he knew it, and the knowledge made him more careful rather than less. He was the witness. He was the one who had been there. There was more ocean ahead. There was India, enormous and complicated, and waiting for him like a problem he had been assigned to solve. There was the court of a sultan who would give him more power than he had ever held and more danger than he had ever faced. But first there were the monsoon winds, filling the sail of the dhow above him, pushing him north and east across the Indian Ocean toward whatever came next. He watched the African coast disappear behind him. He had seen things that no one from Tangier had ever seen. He had barely started. Chapter 6. Anatolia, the Golden Horde, and the Edge of Europe. There is a moment in long travel when the road stops feeling like a deviation from ordinary life and starts feeling like ordinary life itself. When the fixed point you departed from becomes the abstraction and the moving world becomes the only reality that fully makes sense. Ibn Battuta's account suggests he had reached that moment somewhere in the years between his first Hajj and his eventual arrival in India. He had been on the road for close to a decade. He had covered more ground than most people of his era would cover in several lifetimes, and he was still moving, still turning toward whatever was interesting, still incapable of passing something worth seeing in order to reach something else more quickly. The journey that took him north into Anatolia and across the Black Sea into the steppes of the Golden Horde was not on any direct route to anywhere he was nominally heading. It happened because a funeral was travelling north, and the funeral belonged to a woman whose situation was too unusual to leave behind. The woman was a Byzantine princess, the daughter of the Emperor of Constantinople, who had married a Mongol Khan of the Golden Horde, converted to Islam, lived for years as a Muslim queen in the steppe world, and was now, having died far from her birthplace, being returned to Constantinople for burial among her own people. Ibn Battuta attached himself to the funeral cortege in the region south of the Black Sea and rode north with it, drawn not by any obligation but by the human strangeness of the situation. A Christian princess who had become a Muslim queen going home to be buried among Christians, carrying with her a life that had crossed more boundaries than most people of her era would have thought possible. He went because it was interesting. This is, at its core, the explanation for a great deal of what Ibn Battuta did across 29 years of travel. Anatolia in the 1330s was a landscape in transition. The great Seljuk Sultanate that had controlled the region for 2 centuries had collapsed under the pressure of the Mongol invasions, and in the vacuum left by its dissolution, a collection of small Turkish principalities had emerged, each carving out its territory with the competitive energy of states that are new enough to still be determining what they are. One of these principalities was centered on the recently taken city of Bursa, expanded by a ruler named Orhan, son of a man named Osman. Looking back from the distance of centuries, we know that the state Osman had founded and Orhan was building would eventually become the Ottoman Empire, one of the longest lasting and most consequential states in the history of the world. But Ibn Battuta had no such vantage point. When he passed through, it was a minor principality among several, with nothing visible to distinguish it from the others, competing for position in western Anatolia. He describes it briefly and moves on. This is one of the more quietly striking moments in the entire account. The most travelled observer of the 14th century passed within sight of the institution that would one day control territory from the gates of Vienna to the borders of Persia and endure for 6 centuries. And he saw a small local court of no particular distinction. History does not announce itself. You have to already know what you are looking at. The funeral cortege carried him north to the coast of the Black Sea, and from there he crossed the water and entered the territory of the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that controlled the vast grassland steppe north of the Black Sea and the Caspian. The Golden Horde had converted to Islam, and its Khan, Ozbeg Khan, was among the most powerful rulers in the world at the time of Ibn Battuta's visit, controlling a territory that stretched from the Danube in the west toward the edges of Siberia in the east. Ozbeg Khan's court was a mobile city, a vast collection of tents and wagons that moved across the steppe with the seasonal rhythms that nomadic life required, carrying the administrative apparatus of a major state in a form that could be dismantled and reassembled in hours. Ibn Battuta describes it with the detailed attention of someone who has never seen anything like it and is determined to record every particular before the impression fades. The scale of it astonished him. The Khan's tent city covered miles. It had its own markets, its own mosques, its own administrative districts. Officials received petitioners in tents furnished with silk and gold. The court functioned with a ceremony and a protocol that was entirely recognizable to someone trained in the sedentary Islamic world, but translated into a nomadic context that gave it a quality at once more austere and more overwhelming than anything he had previously encountered. He met the Khan and was received with the respect appropriate to a distinguished scholar from the Islamic West. He attended the court's religious observances. He ate the food of the steppe and describes it with the honest ambivalence of a man from a Mediterranean culture encountering a diet built around ingredients his palate was not prepared for. He also observed something he describes at considerable length. In a way that makes clear he found it genuinely remarkable and not entirely comfortable. The women of the Golden Horde court moved through public space with a freedom that the Islamic world Ibn Battuta had grown up in would not have considered standard practice. The wives and daughters of the Khan and his nobles appeared in public, travelled in carts alongside men who were not their relatives, and conducted themselves with a social ease that sat uneasily with his own formation. He describes his discomfort with an honesty that is one of his most useful qualities as a source. He does not pretend to be more open-minded than he is. He does not perform an acceptance he does not feel. He describes his reaction, attributes it to his background, and continues observing. He is neither an uncritical admirer of everything foreign, nor a reflexive condemner of difference. He is a man with a specific background trying to honestly account for a world that does not always fit the categories that background provided. His honesty on this point has made his account valuable to scholars of gender history, who have used his observations about women's roles across the various societies he travelled through to construct a comparative picture that no other single source makes possible. From the Golden Horde's territory he went south again toward the Black Sea coast, and then he made the trip that is perhaps the most unexpected single journey in an account full of unexpected journeys. He went to Constantinople. The Byzantine princess had asked him to accompany her to her father's court, and he had agreed. And now he was riding into the most significant city of the Christian world, a journey that most inhabitants of the Islamic world at that time would have considered somewhere between unusual and unthinkable. Constantinople in the 1330s was not the city it had been. The Byzantine Empire was a diminished state. Its territory, reduced by centuries of pressure and the Fourth Crusade that had resulted in Constantinople itself being sacked and occupied by Western Christians in 1204. The city was still magnificent by almost any standard. The great dome of the Hagia Sophia still represented one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements in the known world, but it carried in the mood of its streets the particular weight of a civilization that had been contracting for a long time and knew it. Ibn Battuta describes his arrival with a detail that historians have found genuinely useful. He describes the Hagia Sophia, the monks and priests and religious processions, the bells that regulated the city's day, with the careful attention of a man who finds the Christian world genuinely foreign but genuinely worth understanding. He was received at the court of the Emperor Andronikos III with courtesy, given a residence and guards, and spent several weeks moving through the city with the systematic attention he brought to every place he visited. He was among the most travelled people alive, and he was standing in the throne room of the Byzantine emperor, and he was taking notes. He left Constantinople, heading back east through the steppe and south, toward territories more familiar to his formation, carrying in his account a description of the Byzantine capital that is among the few surviving accounts of 14th century Constantinople written from an outside perspective. From the Golden Horde territory he turned east and south, moving through the Central Asian cities of the Silk Road. He passed through Samarkand and Bukhara, cities whose names had been known in the Islamic world for centuries, whose scholars and poets had contributed to the intellectual tradition he had grown up studying. The Mongol destruction had touched these cities too, and like Baghdad, they were in the process of rebuilding. There, libraries and schools and markets reassembling themselves with the patient determination of civilizations that understand that destruction is not the final word. He spent time in each of them. He met scholars. He attended courts. He added to the chain of credentials and connections that was the infrastructure of his life on the road. Then he rested for a moment in Samarkand, in a garden beside a canal, on a warm afternoon when the city was quiet. The Rihla does not record what he thought in that moment, but he had been on the road for 9 years. He had crossed more ground than almost any recorded traveller before him, and the Hindu Kush still lay ahead, and beyond it India, and beyond India everything else. He rose. He turned south, toward the mountains, toward the passes through the Hindu Kush, toward India. He was 30 years old, and he was healthy, and he was about to enter the most complicated and the most dangerous episode of his entire career. He did not know that yet. He just knew the road was leading south, through the mountains, toward a country that everyone who had been there told him was unlike anything he had encountered. They were right. Chapter 7. India, the Sultan's Judge. The Hindu Kush in midsummer is not a place that makes arrival easy. The passes through the mountains that separate Central Asia from the Indian subcontinent are high and cold even in summer, narrow in places to a width that makes the line between the path and the void feel uncomfortably close, and watched over by communities that had been extracting tolls and occasionally creating difficulties for travellers for as long as anyone could remember. Ibn Battuta crossed them in the summer of 1333. In a large caravan that had safety in numbers but not in speed, picking its way through the mountain landscape with the careful attention of people who understood that a single wrong step had permanent consequences. He came down out of the mountains onto the plains of what is now Afghanistan, and then Pakistan, and then India, with the sense, which his account conveys in terms that are still vivid, of entering a different world. Not just a different culture or a different political system, though both of those were true. A different quality of reality. The scale of the subcontinent, the density of its population, the heat and noise and colour and complexity of its cities, the sheer volume of human life pressing in from every direction, was unlike anything the Mediterranean world, or the steppe, or even Cairo had prepared him for. India, in 1333, was under the rule of the Delhi Sultanate, and the Delhi Sultanate was under the rule of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, one of the most extraordinary and most difficult rulers in the history of the subcontinent. Muhammad bin Tughlaq was, by the accounts of everyone who knew him, a man of genuine intelligence, extraordinary energy, and an almost complete inability to translate good intentions into workable policy. He was generous to a fault, literally, distributing gold from the treasury with a lavishness that repeatedly threatened to bankrupt the state. He was learned, genuinely so, able to hold his own in discussions of theology and philosophy and logic with the best scholars of his court. He was also, when crossed or when his elaborate plans failed, capable of responses that contemporary observers found difficult to account for by any ordinary standard of proportion. Ibn Battuta had heard about Muhammad bin Tughlaq before he arrived in India. The word that had travelled west and north and in every direction from Delhi was simple. Come, the Sultan gives gold to scholars. Ibn Battuta came. The journey from the mountain passes to Delhi took weeks, through cities and towns and agricultural landscapes of extraordinary richness. He arrived in Delhi in 1334, presented his credentials at the court, and was received by Muhammad bin Tughlaq with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely valued learned company and was prepared to pay very well for it. The Sultan appointed him a judge, a qadi, for the city of Delhi. This was an extraordinary appointment. It was also, from Ibn Battuta's perspective, something considerably more complicated than an honour. It was a trap. Not a malicious trap, not a trap set with any intention of harming him, but a trap nonetheless, because accepting the appointment meant accepting the Sultan's patronage, and accepting the Sultan's patronage meant being subject to the Sultan's will, and the Sultan's will was something that changed direction with a speed and an unpredictability that made long-term planning essentially impossible for anyone in his orbit. He served as judge in Delhi for 8 years. Those 8 years are the most densely eventful period of his entire account, and reading them is like watching a man try to keep his footing on a surface that is constantly shifting beneath him, sometimes toward wealth and safety, sometimes toward something considerably darker. Muhammad bin Tughlaq's court was a place of genuine intellectual life and genuine terror in proportions that were never entirely stable. The Sultan gathered scholars and poets and physicians and philosophers from across the Islamic world with a generosity that was real and a control that was total. He gave lavishly, and he punished severely. And the distance between the two states was not always clear until you were already in one or the other. Ibn Battuta received gifts of extraordinary value. He was given houses and servants and horses and money on a scale that a judge from Tangier had no frame of reference for. He was also, on at least one occasion, sufficiently outside the Sultan's favour that he spent a period of genuine uncertainty, not knowing whether the next development in his situation would be more gifts or something considerably worse. He describes the Sultan's punishments with a restraint that does not quite conceal the unease underneath. He mentions men executed for offences that seem, by any rational standard, disproportionate to the response. He describes the court's atmosphere in terms that make clear everyone in it was operating under a constant awareness that the Sultan's goodwill was the only thing standing between them and catastrophe. The Sultan's famous failed policies unfolded during Ibn Battuta's time at court. The most notorious was the decision to move the capital from Delhi to a new city 600 miles south in the Deccan Plateau, a decision that required the forced relocation of the entire population of Delhi, and that ended in disaster when the new capital proved unworkable, and the population had to be moved back. Ibn Battuta describes this episode with the specific quality of someone who witnessed an enormous human catastrophe and is still, years later, trying to make sense of it. He also travelled extensively during this period on the Sultan's business, through the cities of the Deccan and the coasts of the Indian Ocean, through landscapes and communities that added continuously to the picture he was assembling of a world far larger and more complex than anything he had set out from Tangier imagining. India, for Ibn Battuta, was an education in the limits of the frameworks he had brought with him. The Islamic world he had travelled through in his first years on the road was, for all its variety, a world organised around principles he understood. To India had its own Islamic culture, sophisticated and deep-rooted, but it existed alongside and in constant negotiation with Hindu traditions, with Buddhist communities, with Jain scholars, with a variety of religious and cultural practice that the world he had come from did not have an adequate framework for understanding. He describes the yogis he encounters with a fascination that is tinged with genuine unease. He describes Hindu temples and their practices with the discomfort of a man whose monotheism is deeply felt. But he describes them. He does not look away. He does not reduce what he sees to a simple dismissal. He looks and he records and he leaves the full complexity of what he saw on the page for readers 7 centuries later to encounter. By the late 1330s, a rebellion had broken out in the Deccan, and the Sultan's increasingly erratic responses to political challenges made the entire court feel like a structure that might collapse without warning. Ibn Battuta found himself navigating a situation where his association with the Sultan was simultaneously his protection and his greatest vulnerability, where the credentials that had brought him to Delhi and kept him there were now also the thing that made it impossible to simply walk away. He had been in India for 8 years. He had held judicial power he had never expected to hold. He had eaten at the Sultan's table and slept under the Sultan's roof and spent 8 years never quite knowing, from one season to the next, whether the man at the centre of all of it was going to reward him or destroy him. He was tired. He was also, by any honest reading of his account, genuinely frightened in a way that the earlier dangers of his travels, the rebel attack in the forest, the storm at Calicut harbour, had not quite produced in him. Those had been sudden. This was sustained. The fear of a man who has been living inside an unpredictable system for 8 years and who understands, with the clarity that only prolonged exposure produces, that his continued survival depends entirely on the continued goodwill of someone whose goodwill cannot be reliably predicted. He made a decision. He told the Sultan that he wished to perform the Hajj again, to return to Mecca on pilgrimage. It was a request that the Sultan, for all his unpredictability, could not easily refuse. A Muslim ruler who prevented a devout scholar from fulfilling his religious obligations would face a kind of condemnation that had real costs. The Sultan agreed. Ibn Battuta sat with that agreement for a moment. The Rihla suggests, with the particular quality of relief that comes when an exit you have been trying to find for a long time suddenly appears. And then, in the manner characteristic of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, The Sultan immediately complicated the agreement. He told Ibn Battuta that he would first be sent to China as his ambassador to the court of the Yuan emperor. After completing the mission, he would be free to make the Hajj. Ibn Battuta accepted. He was leaving India. Whatever came next, whatever China turned out to be, he was leaving a court that had given him extraordinary wealth and extraordinary anxiety in equal measure, leaving a city where he had spent 8 years, never fully certain of his own safety. He walked out of the Sultan's presence and into the corridor beyond, and the Rihla records nothing of what he felt in that moment, but he had been afraid for a long time, and now he was going. That was enough. Chapter 8. The Mission to China. The road to China nearly killed him before he left India. Ibn Battuta set out from Delhi in 1341 with an embassy that reflected the scale of Muhammad bin Tughlaq's ambitions and the Sultan's particular genius for grand gestures that collapsed under the weight of their own complexity. The mission to the Yuan emperor was not a modest diplomatic exchange. It was a statement. The Sultan sent gifts of extraordinary value: horses and silk and gold vessels, and a large entourage organized into a procession that moved south from Delhi toward the coast with the slow grandeur of a state occasion. Ibn Battuta was nominally in charge of this procession. He had no military training. He had no experience commanding large bodies of people across hostile terrain. He was a legal scholar from Tangier who had spent 8 years as a judge in Delhi, and he was now responsible for delivering an embassy of several hundred people and an enormous quantity of valuable goods to the coast, where ships would be waiting to carry them to China. The rebels got there first. The journey south from Delhi passed through territory in active rebellion against the Sultan's authority. The embassy was attacked. In the chaos that followed, the procession scattered. People were killed. Gifts were lost. Ibn Battuta himself was captured by a group of rebels and held for what he describes, with the brevity he brings to personal danger throughout his account, as days he was not confident would end in his survival. He escaped. He does not dwell on how. He walked away from his captors during a moment of confusion, moved through the forest without a clear sense of direction, survived on whatever he could find, and eventually made his way back to the road and then to the coast, arriving at the port city of Calicut on the southwestern coast of India, with a fraction of the original embassy still intact, and the rest scattered or gone. The ships were waiting. Several large Chinese vessels and some smaller dhows, loaded and ready to carry the embassy across the Indian Ocean. The gifts that had survived the attack were loaded. The remaining members of the mission went aboard. Ibn Battuta did not go aboard. He describes his reason with the honest simplicity of a man who has accepted that some of his decisions do not reflect well on him. The ships were the largest he had ever seen. Chinese junks that dwarfed the dhows of the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. He was afraid of them, not cautiously reluctant, genuinely afraid in the physical way that his years of ocean travel had produced in a man who was not built for the sea and had never pretended otherwise. He went ashore to pray in a nearby mosque the night before departure, intending to return to the ship in the morning. That night, a storm hit the harbour. When Ibn Battuta came back to the waterfront in the morning, the scene he found was one of the most devastating moments in his entire account. One of the large Chinese junks had sunk in the harbour. Everyone aboard was dead. Another ship had been driven out to sea by the storm and had disappeared, carrying with it the majority of the embassy's remaining gifts, and most of the surviving members of the mission. Everything was gone. The Sultan's embassy to China, assembled over months in Delhi, had been destroyed in a single night by a storm in Calicut harbour. Ibn Battuta had survived because he had been afraid to board the ship. He stood on the dock in the early morning and looked at the harbour. The water was quiet now. The storm passed. The sky clearing. There was wreckage floating near the shore. There was nothing else where the ships had been. He was standing on a dock in Calicut with no embassy, no gifts, no authority, no money, and a very clear understanding that returning to Delhi in these circumstances was likely to be dangerous. Muhammad bin Tughlaq's responses to failure were not, as a rule, calibrated to the degree of culpability involved. The embassy was gone. Someone would be blamed. The man nominally in charge of the embassy, who had not been on the ships, was an obvious candidate. He did not go back to Delhi. Instead, he did what he had always done when the road closed in one direction. He went in another direction. He went south to the Maldive Islands, the chain of low coral atolls sitting in the Indian Ocean southwest of the tip of India. And there began one of the strangest episodes in a life that was not short of strange episodes. The Maldives in the 1340s were a Muslim sultanate of modest military power and considerable strategic importance, sitting astride the shipping routes of the central Indian Ocean in a position that made every fleet moving between Arabia and the Indian subcontinent dependent on their goodwill for water and provisions. The islands were governed by a queen named Khadija, whose court was, by Ibn Battuta's account, sophisticated and well organized and possessed of a relaxed elegance that the island environment seemed to produce. He was welcomed. He was given a house. He was appointed chief judge of the Maldives. This is the second time in his account that Ibn Battuta finds himself holding significant judicial authority in a place he had not intended to stay. And the pattern is instructive. He was good at his work. He understood Islamic law with a depth that the communities he served genuinely needed. He was also, in both cases, a man who found the authority he had been given gradually becoming a constraint rather than a freedom, as the obligations of office accumulated and the road, still calling, became harder to answer. In the Maldives, he lasted roughly a year and a half before the combination of difficult rulings, cultural friction, and the pull of the road beyond the horizon made departure the obvious choice. He left the Maldives heading northeast, toward Ceylon, the large island at the tip of India that was in the 14th century a pilgrimage destination for Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims alike. He climbed Adam's Peak, the mountain at the island's centre that Muslim tradition held to contain the footprint of Adam himself, and describes the climb with a physicality that is different from most of his descriptions of sacred places. More embodied, more specific about the altitude and the difficulty and the quality of the light at the summit. From Ceylon he sailed northeast along the Bay of Bengal, through the ports of the Coromandel coast, to Bengal at the mouth of the Ganges, where rice agriculture supported one of the densest populations on earth. Then he turned east again, toward the Malay Peninsula and the islands of Southeast Asia, and finally toward China. The journey through the eastern Indian Ocean and the South China Sea took months. A series of passages from port to port, through waters busy with traffic, through ports embedded in their own complex trading networks that had almost nothing to do with the Islamic world he had spent his life travelling through. He passed through what is now Malaysia and Indonesia, through the Sultanate of Samudra Pasai on the northern coast of Sumatra, among the earliest Islamic states in Southeast Asia, whose ruler received him with the warmth of a Muslim sovereign, happy to welcome a distinguished scholar from the heartland of the faith. He arrived on the coast of China in the summer of 1345, roughly 4 years after leaving Delhi, having travelled by a route so circuitous that it had taken him through 6 countries that were not on any direct path between India and China. He was in China. He was 41 years old, and he had been on the road for 20 years, and he was standing on the coast of a country that was, in the 14th century, among the most populous and in many respects among the most technically accomplished civilizations on earth. He looked at it with the expression that his account suggests he brought to every new arrival. He took out his notebook. He began to write. Chapter 9. China and the limits of the known world. China was the edge, not the edge of the earth, which Ibn Battuta understood was not a flat surface with a physical boundary, but the edge of the world he had been trained to navigate, the world whose languages and laws and social codes and religious frameworks his education had given him tools to read. Beyond China, in the geography of the 14th century Islamic world, there was nothing that any traveller he had ever met had described from personal experience. He arrived on the southeastern coast of China in a country that was in the final decades of Mongol rule. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan after the Mongol conquest of China in the 13th century, was still nominally in control, though the strains that would eventually produce the Ming dynasty's rebellion were already visible to anyone paying close attention. Ibn Battuta does not fully understand what he is seeing in China, and he is honest about this in a way that is one of the most striking features of his entire account. Throughout his travels, from Morocco to Mali to Persia to India, he had been able to position himself within a framework of reference that made the societies he encountered legible to him. They were Islamic, or they were in relationship with the Islamic world in ways that gave him access points. He had the language of Arabic scholarship. He had the network of mosques and madrasas and scholars that existed across the entire span of the world he had travelled. He had credentials that opened doors. In China, almost none of that worked. The language was impenetrable. The social codes were organized around assumptions that had no equivalent in anything he had previously encountered. The religious landscape, the Buddhism and Taoism, and the various traditions that structured Chinese spiritual life, was organized on principles that his entire formation had not equipped him to fully engage with. He was, for the first time in 20 years of travel, genuinely at a loss, not physically lost. He was moving through the country in the company of guides and with the support of Chinese Muslim communities that existed in the coastal cities and the major inland centres, communities whose ancestors had come from the Islamic West along the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean routes, and who maintained their faith and their Arabic learning as a distinct tradition within the larger Chinese society. These communities were his lifeline. In every major Chinese city he visited, he found a mosque, a Muslim quarter, a network of people who shared his language and his reference points, and who were able to translate between the world he came from and the world he was moving through. They fed him and housed him and explained, patiently, the features of Chinese society that confused him most. He describes China's cities with a wonder that is different from the wonder he brings to the cities of the Islamic world. It is not the wonder of recognition, of finding familiar things in unfamiliar settings. It is the wonder of genuine foreignness, of encountering a scale and a sophistication that he can observe but not entirely account for. The cities are enormous. He describes Quanzhou, one of the great port cities of the southeastern coast, as among the largest ports he has ever seen, and he has seen the ports of Cairo and Calicut and Hormuz. He describes the pottery that the Chinese produce with the appreciation of a man who understands craftsmanship and is not too proud to say so. He describes the postal system, the network of relay stations that allowed messages to move across the enormous distances of the Chinese interior with a speed that he finds almost impossible to believe, and describes carefully, because he understands his readers will feel the same skepticism. He describes the paper money that functions as currency across the entire country, a feature of Chinese economic life that has no equivalent in anything he had previously encountered. He describes the Grand Canal, the artificial waterway connecting the major cities of eastern China across a distance of over 1,000 miles, as an engineering achievement that exceeds anything he has seen elsewhere. He is right. It does. He travels north toward the Yuan capital, which he calls Kanbalik, the city that is now Beijing. The journey takes weeks, through a landscape of extraordinary agricultural productivity, through cities whose markets are larger and better supplied than anything he has seen elsewhere, through a countryside populated with a density that speaks to a civilization that has been accumulating people and expertise and material culture for a very long time. At Kanbalik he encounters a court that is, in its ceremony and complexity, recognizable to him as the court of a great ruler, even if every specific detail is organized around principles he does not fully understand. He records the architecture of the palace complex, the ceremony of the court, the food and the clothing and the social organization of a civilization operating on a scale that is new to him. He also records his own limitations honestly. He cannot speak the language. He cannot read the writing. He is dependent on interpreters for every exchange that goes beyond gesture and context. He is, in China, permanently one step removed from direct engagement with the society he is trying to describe. This honesty matters. It means that his account of China is necessarily less detailed than his accounts of the Islamic world, more dependent on what other people tell him than on direct observation. It means that some of what he reports about China has been questioned by historians who find details that do not align with the historical record as understood from Chinese sources. Some scholars have suggested that portions of his Chinese chapters may incorporate information from other travellers and from geographical texts available in Fez rather than exclusively from direct observation. The debate continues among specialists, and the evidence is genuinely uncertain. What is certain is that he reached China, that he arrived at the eastern edge of the world he had set out to explore, that he stood on the shores of the South China Sea and understood, perhaps for the first time in 20 years of continuous travel, that he had gone as far as the known world extended. He walked down to the water on his last day on the eastern coast. The South China Sea stretched ahead of him, vast and grey-green and indifferent, extending to a horizon that held nothing he recognized. No city he had heard of, no route that any traveller he had ever met had described. He stood there for a while. The account does not record what he thought. But the man who had walked out of Tangier at 21 years old, weeping at the city gate, had crossed more countries than almost any recorded traveller before him. He had arrived at the farthest point a scholar from the Islamic West had yet reached. He had gone as far as the world he knew allowed him to go. He looked east across the water for a long moment. Then he turned around. He was going home. Not directly. Nothing in his life had ever moved directly. There were the Maldives again, and Ceylon, and the coast of India, and the Persian Gulf, and the sacred cities of Arabia, and the long road back across the Middle East and North Africa. There was also, waiting for him, somewhere on that road home, a catastrophe so large that it would reshape the entire world he had spent his life crossing. The Black Death was coming. He did not know that yet. He just knew the road was behind him now. Stretching west across the world, he had spent his life learning. He began to walk. Chapter 10. The Black Death and the Journey Home. He left China in 1346. The journey home was supposed to be the simpler part. He had done the hard travelling. He had crossed the mountains and the oceans and the steppes, and had arrived at the far edge of the known world and turned around. The road back passed through landscapes he had already crossed, in pieces and fragments across 20 years. And the familiar worlds of the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula were waiting for him like old acquaintances. The world had other plans. Something was moving west across Asia in the 1340s. Something that had no name yet, and that the people encountering it had no framework for understanding. It moved through communities the way fire moves through dry grass, fast and total and indifferent to everything in its path. It killed with a speed that made the ordinary rhythms of illness and recovery seem like a different category of experience entirely. It would eventually be called the Black Death. By the time Ibn Battuta encountered it on his journey home, it had already moved through enormous stretches of Central Asia and China and the Middle East. It would go on to kill. By estimates that historians have constructed from the fragmentary records available, and that continue to be debated and refined, tens of millions of people across Eurasia and North Africa, reducing the population of some regions by a third or more, and reshaping the trajectory of human civilization in ways that scholars are still tracing. Ibn Battuta walked into it. He first encountered clear evidence of the plague on his way through the Persian Gulf region, in the cities of Persia and Iraq that he had passed through a decade earlier on his way east. The cities were changed, not just reduced, not just damaged, but fundamentally altered in their texture, in the ratio of the living to the spaces the dead had occupied. Markets that had been full were quiet. Neighbourhoods that had been dense were empty. The scholars he sought out were not always findable, because many of them were dead. He describes the plague in his account with a precision that historians of epidemic disease have found worth examining. He notes the speed of death, the way a person could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening. He notes the geographic spread, the way it moved along trade routes, following the same paths that goods and people had been moving along for centuries, as though the infrastructure of commerce had been repurposed as the infrastructure of catastrophe. He also describes the human responses to it, and these are among the most affecting passages in his entire account. He describes communities that maintained their religious practices in the face of mass death. Friday prayers attended by thousands in cities where thousands more were dying. He describes the theological framework that his tradition brought to the experience of plague. The understanding of death as something to be faced with acceptance rather than panic, a framework that was genuinely sustaining to some and genuinely insufficient to others. He describes the numbers in Damascus. He was told the plague was killing several thousand people a day at its peak. He describes this with the quiet astonishment of a man who has spent his life in cities and understood their scale and cannot quite process what that number means for the human texture of a place. Damascus had been one of the most beautiful and most vital cities he had ever visited, a city he had loved from his first encounter with it 20 years earlier on the road to Mecca. Damascus, in 1348, was a city processing an apocalypse. He moved through it and beyond it, heading south toward the Arabian Peninsula, toward Mecca and Medina, toward the sacred cities that were themselves not exempt from the plague's reach. He performed the Hajj again, in a sacred city that was diminished from what he had known, its population reduced, its mood carrying the weight of what the world had been going through. He spent time in the Hejaz and then began the long movement west and north, back toward North Africa, back toward Tangier. The journey home brought him through landscapes that the plague had touched with uneven severity. Some cities had been devastated, others had escaped with fewer losses, for reasons that no one in the 14th century understood, and that science would eventually explain in terms of transmission routes and population density and the specific biology of a bacterium that the medieval world had no tools to identify. He arrived in North Africa, moving west along the coastal route, through the cities of Egypt and Libya and Tunisia and Algeria that he had passed through as a 21-year-old heading east with his whole life ahead of him. The cities were changed, not just by the plague, though the plague had touched them all. They were changed in the way that 20 years of additional history changes places, in their politics and their populations and their physical fabric. He was changed too. He was 45 years old. He had been on the road for 24 years. He had covered more ground than almost any recorded traveller in history. He had held judicial authority in 2 separate countries on 2 separate continents. He had survived a rebel attack in the forests of India, the destruction of an entire diplomatic mission in Calicut harbour, and a plague that was reshaping the world around him as he walked through it. He had also lost people. The account handles this with the restraint that characterizes its treatment of personal emotion throughout. But the losses are there, if you read carefully. Companions who did not survive the road, wives left behind in cities he never returned to. The long accumulation of absence that 24 years of continuous movement necessarily produces. He arrived in Tangier in 1349. He was home. His father had died years earlier. He had known this from letters on the road, the slow and uncertain correspondence that the medieval world made possible. He had absorbed the news at whatever distance it found him and carried it forward, the way you carry grief when there is nowhere to set it down. But his mother had still been alive when he left, and the first thing he wanted to know when he arrived at the city gate was whether she was still living. She was not. She had died of the plague weeks before he arrived. He had been 21 years old when he walked out of that gate. She had stood there watching him go, and he had wept. And she had presumably believed he would be back within a year or 2 at the outside. He had been gone for 24 years, and she had died of the same plague he had been walking through for the past 2 years. Weeks before he returned, close enough that the timing feels, across the centuries, like something deliberately cruel. The Rihla records this in a few sentences. The fact of her death, the mourning rituals he performed, and then, in the manner of a man who has learned over 24 years that the road requires you to absorb loss and keep moving. He kept moving. He sat in the house he had grown up in the city he had left as a young man, in the room where his mother was no longer present, and he understood something that he had perhaps been approaching for a long time without quite arriving at it. The world he had set out to see was gone now in certain essential ways. The scholars he had studied with in the sacred cities were dead. The merchants he had travelled with on the Indian Ocean routes were dead. The court of Muhammad bin Tughlaq in Delhi had been disrupted and diminished by the plague's passage. The cities of Persia and Iraq that he had found so beautiful on his way east were quiet in ways that had nothing to do with the time of day. He had spent 24 years crossing a world, and the world he had crossed was not entirely the world that remained. He did not stay in Tangier for long. He went to the Iberian Peninsula, to the parts of Spain that were still under Muslim rule, the remnant of a civilization that had once controlled most of the peninsula, and that was, by the 1340s, reduced to the Emirate of Granada in the south. He visited Granada and the surviving Muslim cities of Andalusia and described them with the appreciation of a man who understood he was looking at a civilization in its final chapter, still beautiful, still sophisticated, but surrounded by forces that would not stop until there was nothing left. He was right. Granada would fall in 1492, roughly 143 years after Ibn Battuta walked its streets. But Tangier could not hold him. The part of the world he had not yet seen was not a small part. He had never crossed the Sahara going south. He had never seen the great empire of Mali that controlled the gold trade, funding the prosperity of the entire North African coast. He had never visited the city of Timbuktu that scholars across the Islamic world described with a reverence that made it sound like one of the intellectual centres of the age. He was 45 years old, and he had been to China and India and Constantinople and the East African coast and the steppes of Central Asia, and he had never been to the country a few weeks south of where he was born. He began to prepare. The road was calling again. It was always calling. Chapter 11. Mali and the Last Great Journey. The Sahara is not a place that tolerates the unprepared. It is among the largest hot deserts on earth. Covering roughly 3 million square miles of North Africa in a landscape of sand and rock and gravel that offers almost nothing to a human being who arrives without adequate preparation and reliable local knowledge. The temperature swings between extremes that would kill an unprotected person in hours. The water sources are separated by distances that require precise navigation to locate, because a caravan that misses a well in the Sahara does not simply experience discomfort. It does. Ibn Battuta crossed the Sahara in 1352, heading south from the Moroccan city of Sijil Masa toward the Empire of Mali, in a caravan that was large enough and experienced enough to manage the crossing if nothing went badly wrong. He was 48 years old. He had been home in Tangier for roughly 3 years, a longer period of relative stability than any since he had first left in 1325. The pull south was stronger than all of it. The Empire of Mali was, in the 1350s, among the wealthiest states in the world by the measure of contemporary observers and the evidence that historians have since examined. Its wealth came from gold. moving north through trans-Saharan trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to the markets of North Africa and the Mediterranean and beyond. The Malian emperor Mansa Musa had made the Hajj in 1324, 1 year before Ibn Battuta left Tangier, and his pilgrimage had become one of the most discussed single events in the history of the medieval Islamic world. He had travelled with an entourage of tens of thousands of people, and a quantity of gold so large that his spending in Cairo and the other cities he passed through had caused a measurable decline in the price of gold across the eastern Mediterranean for years afterward. Every scholar in the Islamic world had heard about it. Every traveller who passed through the markets of North Africa had heard some version of the story. Ibn Battuta had been hearing it since he first left home. He crossed the Sahara in 2 months, in the company of a caravan that moved at the pace that desert survival required, stopping at the water sources that the caravan leaders knew from experience, and that were not always where any map suggested they would be. He describes the crossing with a physicality that makes the difficulty specific and real. The heat during the day, the cold at night, the disorientation that the featureless landscape produced, the way that days of travel across an identical surface made it difficult to maintain a reliable sense of how far you had come and how far you had yet to go. He arrived in the Saharan salt mining settlement of Tagaza, a place built almost entirely from blocks of salt, including its buildings, and describes it with the precision of someone who has never imagined that human beings would live in such a place and wants to record every particular before the impression fades. The workers who mined the salt there lived in conditions of real hardship, cutting the blocks that were loaded onto camels and carried both north to the markets of Morocco and south to the markets of Mali, where salt was scarce enough to trade at prices that outsiders found startling. He continued south, through the transitional landscape where the desert gradually gave way to the Sahel, and then into the agricultural heartland of Mali itself, the great valley of the Niger River where the empire's cities were built. The Mali he entered in 1352 was governed by Mansa Suleiman, by most accounts a competent and serious ruler, though the extraordinary reach that had made Mansa Musa's Hajj possible was somewhat diminished from its highest point. It was still, by any standard Ibn Battuta had encountered in his travels, an impressive state. He arrived at the court of Mansa Suleiman and was received with a ceremony that he describes at length, partly because the ceremony was genuinely elaborate, and partly because his experience of it was complicated by something he is characteristically honest about. He was disappointed. He had travelled from Morocco to Mali, across 2 months of Saharan desert, as a distinguished scholar with a reputation that should have preceded him, and with expectations shaped by everything he had heard about Malian generosity. Mansa Suleiman's court received him and gave him, as the customary gift to a visiting dignitary, bread and meat and yogurt. Ibn Battuta was offended. He says so directly, in terms more candid than diplomatic, and his frankness about his own reaction is one of the moments in his account where the traveller's carefully maintained composure slips enough to reveal the man underneath. He had been received by the Sultan of Delhi with gifts of extraordinary value, by the Khan of the Golden Horde with the hospitality of the most powerful ruler in the steppe world, by the Emperor of Byzantium with the formal courtesy of an ancient court, and Mansa Suleiman had given him bread and yogurt. He complained. Formally, through the appropriate intermediaries, in the manner of a man who has spent 25 years in the company of the world's most powerful people and has developed, perhaps inevitably, a very clear sense of what he considers his due, Mansa Suleiman responded by improving the gifts, though not to the level that Ibn Battuta had anticipated. Once past the initial disappointment, he settled into the careful observation that was his defining practice and produced one of the most detailed accounts of medieval West Africa that exists in any language. He describes the administration of the empire with the appreciation of a trained legal scholar who recognizes effective governance when he sees it. The security of travel within Mali's territory impressed him deeply. He describes being able to move across enormous distances without fear of robbery or violence, a safety he attributes to the strictness of the Sultan's justice and the efficiency of his administration. He describes the markets of the Niger Bend cities as well supplied and well organized, drawing traders from across the Saharan routes and the savannah to the south. He also describes something that becomes one of the most discussed passages in his entire account. Malian women, he reports, appeared in public without covering their faces, conversed freely with men who were not their relatives, and conducted themselves with a social freedom that his North African formation could not accommodate within his understanding of proper Islamic practice. He complained about this to a local scholar. The scholar's response, as Ibn Battuta records it, is one of the most interesting moments of cross-cultural exchange in the entire account. The scholar told him that the practice was established in their community, that women's interactions with men in this context were not what Ibn Battuta assumed them to be, and that he should not apply the standards of one community to the conduct of another. Ibn Battuta records this response without quite accepting it. He continues to disapprove. But he records the argument made against his disapproval accurately and without distortion, and that intellectual honesty, that willingness to document the counter-argument even when he is not persuaded by it, is one of the qualities that makes his account something considerably more than a simple record of one man's impressions. He visited Timbuktu, the city that had become legendary in the Islamic world for its scholarship and its wealth, and describes it with an enthusiasm that is genuine but also specific. It was a significant city, a genuine centre of learning, with mosques and scholars, and a library tradition that represented one of the intellectual achievements of West African civilization. He describes sitting in the company of scholars whose knowledge of Islamic jurisprudence and theology matched anything he had encountered in the cities of North Africa and the Middle East. He describes the quality of their libraries, the range of texts they had assembled, the seriousness of their engagement with the intellectual tradition they shared. He was, in Timbuktu, in familiar company for the first time since leaving Morocco. He was among scholars who spoke his language, shared his reference points, and valued what he valued. The Sahara had been crossed. The distance had been real. And on the other side of it was a city of genuine learning that the world he came from knew existed but had mostly never visited. He travelled further east along the Niger River, through the city of Gao at the great bend of the river, through landscapes of the West African savannah that were, in the 1350s, among the most productive agricultural regions in the world. He turned north again in 1353, back toward the Sahara, back toward Morocco. The Saharan crossing going north was harder than the crossing going south. He describes delays and difficulties with a specificity that makes clear the desert was not a backdrop to his experience, but a living system with its own demands that every traveller had to negotiate on its own terms. He arrived in Morocco in the spring of 1354. He had been travelling, with a few periods of relative stability, for 29 years. He had covered, by his own account, approximately 75,000 miles, by land and sea, across 4 continents. He had visited more countries than almost any recorded traveller before him. He had been a judge and a diplomat and a pilgrim and a prisoner and a refugee and a guest and an observer, and always, underneath all of those roles, a traveller, constitutionally unable to stop moving for long enough to let the world become familiar. He was 49 years old, and he was home, and the road was, finally, behind him, almost. There was one more thing the world required of him, and it was the thing that would determine whether the extraordinary life he had lived would leave any trace in human memory or simply disappear with him when he died. He had to tell someone what he had seen. Chapter 12. The Rihla, One Man's Memory Against Time. He arrived in Fez in 1354. Fez was the intellectual capital of Morocco, the city of the great Qarawiyyin mosque and university, one of the oldest continuously operating institutions of higher learning in the world. A city whose scholars were in contact with the entire span of the Islamic intellectual tradition and whose libraries contained the accumulated written knowledge of centuries. It was the right place to do what he had been asked to do. The Sultan of Morocco, Abu Inan Faris, had heard about Ibn Battuta. Everyone in the Islamic scholarly world had heard about Ibn Battuta by this point. The man who had been everywhere, who had walked out of Tangier as a 21-year-old and had not stopped moving for nearly 3 decades, who had served as a judge in India and navigated the courts of the Mongol steppe and had crossed the Sahara twice and had been present when the Black Death was consuming the eastern Mediterranean. The Sultan wanted the story written down. He assigned a young scholar named Ibn Juzai al-Kalbi to work with Ibn Battuta, to sit with him and listen as the traveller dictated his account of everything he had seen and everywhere he had been, and to shape that raw material into a text worthy of the tradition of Islamic geographical writing that both men understood and respected. The collaboration began sometime in 1354 and was completed in 1355. Ibn Juzay gave the text a title that translates roughly as "A gift to those who contemplate the wonders of cities and the marvels of travelling." Scholars and readers across the centuries have called it simply the Rihla, the Arabic word for journey. It is roughly 1,000 pages in its modern English translation. The process of its creation raises questions that scholars have been engaging with carefully since the text was first studied seriously in the 19th century. Questions worth sitting with, honestly, because they go to the heart of what the Rihla is and what it is not. Ibn Battuta dictated from memory. He was 49 or 50 years old when he sat down with Ibn Juzay, and he was trying to reconstruct 29 years of travel across 4 continents from a memory that was, by any human standard, remarkable in its retention of detail, but that was still a human memory, subject to compression and the inevitable reshaping that time performs on experience. He had notes. He had kept written records of his travels across the decades, but many of those notes had been lost in the various disasters of his journey. In the shipwreck at Calicut harbour, in the rebel attack on the road south from Delhi, In the half-dozen other occasions where his possessions were seized or destroyed or left behind in the chaos of a sudden departure, he was working, for significant portions of the account, from memory alone. This matters because some of what he remembers does not align perfectly with the historical record as established by other sources. Scholars, including the British researchers Hamilton Gibb and Tim Mackintosh-Smith, who spent years retracing Ibn Battuta's roots and examining the primary sources in detail, have identified passages where the chronology is confused, where rulers he describes meeting were not in the positions he describes at the time he claims to have encountered them, where details do not match what other contemporary sources record. Some of these discrepancies are small and easily explained by the imprecision of memory working across decades. Some are larger and have generated genuine scholarly debate, particularly around the Chinese chapters, about the extent to which the Rihla represents direct observation versus information, drawn from other travellers and from geographical texts available in Fez. Mackintosh-Smith, whose assessment of these questions is among the most careful in the scholarship, concluded that the disputed sections are real but limited, that the overwhelming majority of the Rihla reflects genuine direct observation, and that the passages most questioned likely represent a combination of personal experience and second-hand information that Ibn Battuta and Ibn Juzai did not always clearly distinguish. This is an honest conclusion. It does not diminish the Rihla. It contextualizes it. Every great historical document has its limitations. Herodotus, whose account of the Persian Wars is among the foundational texts of Western historical writing, includes material that modern scholars have identified as inaccurate or shaped by the sources available to him and the audience he was writing for. This does not make Herodotus unreliable. It makes him human, and it makes reading him carefully, with attention to what he could and could not have known, an act of historical intelligence rather than simple consumption. The same is true of Ibn Battuta. What is not in doubt is the extraordinary value of what he got right. His descriptions of the Swahili coast cities are confirmed by the archaeological record. His account of the Delhi Sultanate under Muhammad bin Tughlaq matches contemporary sources with a closeness that demonstrates genuine direct experience. His descriptions of Anatolia in the 1330s have been used by historians of the early Ottoman period as primary source material. His account of the Golden Horde court and customs is one of the most detailed, surviving descriptions of nomadic Mongol court culture from any perspective. He was there. He saw these things. He recorded them with the trained precision of a legal scholar whose education had prepared him for close observation and accurate description. The Rihla was copied and distributed within the Moroccan scholarly community almost immediately after its completion, but it did not, in the centuries immediately following its composition, achieve the widespread recognition that its importance warranted. It was written in Arabic, which limited its immediate audience. Within that world, it circulated primarily in the Maghreb, rather than in the eastern centres of Islamic scholarship, where audiences were larger. It was a work of geography and travel writing, rather than theology or law, a genre that was respected, but that did not carry the institutional weight of the religious sciences. It was found by European scholars in the early 19th century, when French scholarly presence in North Africa brought researchers into contact with North African libraries and manuscripts. A complete manuscript was identified in the 1820s, and the first French translation appeared in the 1850s, edited by Charles de Fremery and Beniamino Raffaello Sanguinetti. Hamilton Gibb produced the first major English translation in the 20th century, and subsequent scholars, including Ross Dunn and Tim Mackintosh-Smith, have made the Rihla increasingly accessible to English-language readers. Ibn Battuta died sometime between 1368 and 1379. The exact date is uncertain, which is itself a small testimony to the limited institutional attention his life received from the record-keepers of his era. He was between 64 and 75 years old. He had returned to Morocco after the completion of the Rihla and had served as a judge in various postings for the remainder of his active life. The man who had been to China and India and Constantinople and the East African coast and the steppes of Central Asia and the heart of West Africa spent his final years doing what his family had always expected him to do. He was a judge. He sat in a court and applied the law he had learned in Tangier and refined across a lifetime of encountering the full variety of human practice that the world contained. He issued rulings. He settled disputes. He adjudicated the conflicts that arose between ordinary people living ordinary lives in the cities of Morocco. The scholar-traveller had always been, underneath the travel, a scholar. The road had been the education, and the law had been the practice. And in the end, he returned to the practice with the depth of understanding that only that education could have given him. He died in Morocco. He was buried, as far as anyone can determine, in the city where he had last served, in a grave that no longer survives with any certainty. The man was gone. The Rihla remained. 1,000 pages of one man's memory, assembled in a room in Fez over the course of a year, dictated from a mind that had absorbed 4 continents and 29 years of continuous travel, and that was trying, at the end of all of it, to give the world an account of what it had seen. It is not a perfect account. No account of anything is perfect. It is a human account, shaped by the limitations of memory and the conventions of its genre and the specific formation of the man who produced it. But it is, for enormous stretches of the 14th century world, the only account we have, and for the places where other sources exist to check it against, it holds up. He was there. He saw these things. He wrote them down. Tangier, 1325. A young man of 21 is weeping at the city gate. He thinks he is going to Mecca and coming home. He has no idea what is actually beginning. Think of everything that follows that morning. The caravan roads of North Africa and the Levant, the sacred cities of Arabia, and the months he stayed when he was supposed to leave, the ruins of Baghdad and the recovering cities of Persia, the dhow routes of the Indian Ocean and the prosperous trading cities of the East African coast, the steppe courts of the Golden Horde and the throne room of the Byzantine Emperor, the mountains of the Hindu Kush and the court of a Sultan who gave gold to scholars and whose goodwill no one could predict from one season to the next, the dock at Caliphate the morning after the storm, with the wreckage of an entire embassy floating quietly in the harbour, the Maldives and Ceylon and Bengal and the long passage east, the coast of China and the moment of standing at the edge of the world he knew and understanding, there was nothing further to go. Then the long road home, through a world the Black Death was moving through in the other direction, and then Tangier, the city gate, his mother gone by weeks. He mourned, he rested, he left again, because Mali was waiting on the other side of the Sahara, and he had never been, and it was worth the crossing. That refusal to let the size of an obstacle be the reason not to try ran through every year of his life, from the morning he walked out of Tangier until the morning he sat down in Fez and began to tell someone what he had found. What he found was a world more varied and more worth paying attention to than any single tradition's account of it had suggested. He found cities that much of his world knew only by rumour. He found scholars in places his education had not mentioned, and courts whose sophistication surprised him, and coastlines whose prosperity the wider world had not adequately imagined. He found, again and again, that the earth was larger than the map anyone had given him, and he wrote it down. The room in Fez, where he dictated the Rihla, is long gone. The manuscript Ibn Juzai wrote in that room has been copied and translated and studied, and is now available to anyone who wants to read it, in English and French and a dozen other languages, accessible to every person who wants to follow a young man from Tangier to the edge of the world he knew and back again. 7 centuries have passed. The specific world he travelled through is gone in the particular forms he encountered it. The Yuan dynasty fell. The Delhi Sultanate collapsed. The Mali Empire diminished. The Golden Horde fragmented. Constantinople fell in 1453 and became something new. But the questions he was asking as he moved through that world are not gone. What does the world actually look like when you go and see it? What do you find when you pay genuine attention to the places the familiar story leaves out? What happens to your assumptions when the road takes you somewhere your formation did not prepare you for? Ibn Battuta answered those questions with his feet and his eyes and his pen. Across 29 years and 75,000 miles. The answers are in the Rihla. He went as far as the world he knew would take him, so that someone, somewhere, reading his account centuries later, would understand that the world was larger and stranger and more worth paying attention to than they had previously supposed. That is not a small thing to leave behind. Sleep well